Rich people have developed some pretty exquisites, not to mention the wave of expensive foreign cuisines emerging in the 1970s. Have you ever wondered what money could really get you at the table in the 70s? Strap in with us and find out. Foie gras is French for fat liver, and it is typically duck and geese you will be eating if you choose to ever have this. In particular, they use poultry that has been fattened up to ensure a vibrant flavor, so this is definitely one of those rich people's hobbies right from the get-go. It was pretty popular in French-American restaurants in the 70s and was a top seller at their menus. But the real market was always to be found in an upper-class neighborhood somewhere in the hills rather than your average Atlanta or Detroit commercial street. It is said that Jewish immigrants from France were the ones who brought it into America's system. But whoever did, we need to write them a very dedicated thank you note. Even if this breaks the average person's bank, it is still a pretty amazing food coma-inducing experience. Though we are not a big fan of the practice of force-feeding the poultry to fatten them up, and neither were a lot of Americans who were concerned about animal welfare. Crab Louie is a bit of a comedic-sounding dish, but it uses one of the most exotic breeds of crab that you can hope to catch in the ocean, which is the Dungeness crab. Usually, this dish is served with lettuce, hard-boiled eggs, and tomatoes, but the magic is all in the Louis dressing, which is made with heavily whipped cream, finely diced green pepper, and sometimes horseradish. The elite would often play around with different kinds of food experiments, which sometimes were pretty authentic to the original recipes, and sometimes were entirely their own brainchildren. Speaking of authenticity, we are not even sure who to pay respects to for this dish. Most people just agree that it popped up in the 20th century in the West Coast and peaked in the 50s to 70s. The earliest reference we can find is Clarence Edwards' Bohemian San Francisco, a 1914 guide to where to eat when there. This next dish goes right back to the French-American Food Harmony channel. Escargot was a dish that dominated during the golden age of Paris, so imagine what rounds it made in America. At rich parties, banquets, and soirees, this would be served very commonly in the decade of the 70s. You have to understand one thing about that decade: people were having a cultural revolution on many fronts, and just as many were interested in trying out more things from the world. Americans were, for the first time in a long while, expanding their horizons, and the wealthy were no different. Hence, escargot, which was first prepared in our country by immigrants looking to run stable restaurants, landed all the way on the tables of the richest in the country. When you actually get to what it is, the dish starts to sound a lot less dreamy, since escargot is just snails lathered in garlic, parsley, white wine, and cognac, served in their own shells. Before you skip 10 seconds forward, we promise it is a lot better than it sounds. Veal has always been considered a pretty pricey cut of meat, and veal Oscar takes the value of it up several tax brackets. Usually, the veal is sautéed and served in the form of cutlets, and since we are still talking about the 1%, you can expect to always find crab or lobster meat as a topping. All the very fancy food terms you hear, like emulsified sauces and hollandaise or béarnaise reductions, would be present when the dish would grace the table of prominent individuals. Today, you will probably find most restaurants serving it with steak, but that was not common in the 70s. You would get white asparagus spears instead. A lot of people appreciated this dish actually, both for its strong, vivid flavors and for its incredible soft and tender sensation. Maybe this is one worth saving up for? It is not too pricey. Well, at least if you eat conservatively for the rest of the weekend. Here is a dish that pays respect to one of our finest states, the ever-timeless baked Alaska. Now you might be thinking how this is rich people's food, since a lot of regular 9-to-5ers like you and us also eat it. But does that mean our more successful countrymen cannot enjoy the delicacies of Alaska? Baked Alaska was the main attraction at restaurants all over the nation in the 60s to 70s after all, since everybody wanted to see a dish made with a blowtorch. Yes, before the likes of MasterChef made the use of blowtorches and high-reaching flames a common sight, it was first done by humble bakers making this 3-part cake. It would have a fluffy base, a dome of ice cream on top, which would finally be sealed with a thick layer of meringue. This meringue would then get torched until it was just golden. Does it not seem interesting? Chateaubriand is a mouthful of a name and an even more colossal of a dish to wash down for your afternoon lunch. Usually, a large front-cut tenderloin grilled deeply. It is the only cut of meat to have its name be inspired by the name of the dish it is used in. This was incredibly popular in the 20th century, and that was partially because the preparation was as interesting as the dish itself. Have you ever heard of a big piece of meat being prepared via grilling it between two smaller cuts of meat? Yeah, that one was new for us too. The steak was usually from the sirloin, and this dish was such a hit that the sauce it came with was also named Chateaubriand. Maybe they could make Chateaubriand plates too, just to make it all come full circle? Then you have the usual lineup of extravagant fine dining like shallots, demi-glaces, white wines, and the best mushrooms money can buy. If you would describe Tornado's Rosini in one word or phrase, it would have to be over the top. This is one of those dishes that makes no apologies for how flashy it is, as the entire intent is to be the show stealer, the heart stopper, the apple, or in this case, steak of everyone's eye. Something you smell and rush towards the table moments after you see it, steaming hot, freshly served with all those rich sauces and toppings, and your mouth immediately starts watering. Well, many of us may have never heard of it before, as its heyday in the 1970s is long past. It is named after an opera composer from Italy, known as Gioacchino Rossini, and the dish itself is a melody of flavors. Even foie gras is just a sidekick to this dish. We mean that literally, since it comes with the steak. You might have noticed that a lot of the items so far are beef or some other kind of red meat. Not a lot of love chicken, but you gotta consider how beef was the dominant meat in the 70s. One of the best ways of having it was widely agreed to be a perfect filet mignon. Now you can find filet mignons for under $20 in many restaurants across the USA. But what does it mean to be wealthy if you do not have everyday things in their most fancy form? A hand-tossed pizza with all kinds of flashy vegetables, wine aged longer than we have been alive, sauces created from scratch using 12 different spices, you get the picture. Even middle-class folk would love to order filet mignons when they were spending a night out just to feel like they were really living it up. It was one of the staple foods of the elite class, and it is one of the most prized cuts of steak you can buy. While this is not beef, it is not chicken either. Our heartfelt apologies to all of our white meat fans. Pheasant under glass is one of the finer arts of poultry-based dishes, and it is served in a reduced wine sauce with shallots. While the name might make you think you are about to get a pheasant under a steel dome like in cartoons back in the 70s, it was really just pheasant breast capped off with a glass dome. Pheasant under glass was not just fine dining, but haute cuisine, and even in popular literature from the 20th centuries. If you wanted to express how a character was making big bucks, you would write about how they were enjoying a fine plate of this dish. When you make $12 an hour, you get soup or broth. When you make what someone does in a year per hour, you get consomme. And yes, before you wonder, this one's French too. The difference between broth and consomme is that while broth is typically thick, consomme is entirely a clarified soup. According to the legend of King Louis XIV, the one who invented it, the dish, when prepared properly, is so clear that you can actually see your reflection in it. Be great for a Pinterest mood board about your lavish summer, don't you think? Since its birth, it has always been associated with luxury, and that did not change at all during the 20th century, especially when French-American joints would serve it as one of their top entrees. What if you are rich and also trying to live a healthier lifestyle? Do the allures of a beef Wellington trap you and doom that calorie deficit, or do you look into all the options big bills can get you? Salmon en croûte was one of those options that well-off people often made a regular part of their diet, and salmon is already famous for being the king of protein. Cut into two with a salmon mousse filling, Swiss chard and puff pastry, the dish exudes an air of premium five-star dining. Plus, that beurre blanc sauce that most places ran with in the 70s was to die for, and white sauces were typical for the dish. This is not only a dish you eat for all the health benefits, but an incredibly effective main course at a party or important gathering, especially if you pair it with croutons and red wine. Among the vast landscape of America's history with food, few dishes have ever made as much of a statement as lobster thermidor has. Diced lobster meat with a bechamel sauce and white wine, usually paired with shallots, Dijon mustard, and Parmesan cheese. This vibrant and incredibly colorful dish is a platter fit for any royalty. Each flavor that comes from the dish is very unique, with an entire world of tastes to uncover with each bite. It makes for a very rich and unique flavor profile that makes all the tedious prep time worth every second. While nobody knows who is responsible for blessing the world, and especially America, with this, we do know for a fact that the dish has pretty deep ties to French history, as most exotic aspects of a rich man's lifestyle do. Considered a fine midpoint between comfort food and gourmet dining, stuffed quail is a dish that people from all economic backgrounds love, but particularly those who are doing pretty all right for themselves. We say this is a middle ground between comfort food and good eating because stuffed quail can be a pretty sophisticated dish, served with sides like truffled broccoli, cauliflower, or creamed spinach or bacon. Yes, you can wrap stuffed quail with bacon and even pack it with delicious strips to really kick things into high gear. Despite what people who want to keep a dignified appearance up would have you believe, a lot of folks did this regularly. After all, the love of bacon, no matter your socioeconomic circumstances, is a deeply American trait. Almondine sounds like a magical dish served to the queen of some elven tribe in the forest, or something you would find roaming the streets of Turkey. But it is a pretty simple dish that European immigrants brought over to America. However, the taste is to die for, which is exactly why a lot of folks with backyards as big as our houses pay top dollar for it. The best thing about this is that you can make almondine with flounder, trout, salmon, or whatever fish you prefer. Also, lemon juice and parsley as a garnish combo will never get old, and we will die on that hill, even if the dish fell out of style towards the 2000s. When you hear the word Jubilee, you think of happy parties surrounded by friends and families alike, and that is exactly the kind of night you would pair Cherries Jubilee with. A pretty flavorful liquor-based dessert that is more than enough to set your taste buds alight. You cook the cherries and flambe them and braise them in cognac brandy or kirsch. Gold rum works too if you feel down in the dumps, not that you will stay in that mood for long after a few bites of this. Imagine the first few days of autumn when cherries are at their peak flavor. Then top it off with a big scoop of vanilla ice cream. What is there not to love about that? If there is one complaint we have with the dish, it is that flambeing the cherries can get pretty technical, which means this is like a proper advanced level dish. But what kind of culinary roller coaster does not take a fair bit of work? We apologize if you might be getting tired of all the French cuisine in the list, but they really do know how to appeal to the tastes of the upper class, especially with things like Soulmunere. Fish dishes might have peaked here entirely. The concept was already great to begin with. A floured and fried fish could never truly go wrong, but once you pair that with melted butter and lemon juice, then it becomes an entirely different beast. While it sounds very simple to prepare and craft, it is a spectacularly difficult dish to nail just right. Some recipes prefer to leave the skin on the fish, while others remove just the dark skin and cook it in butter. How would you prefer yours? Okay, here is a break from all the fish and red meats and French cooking. Raclet is a Swiss dish that is typically melted cheese, particularly the parts that brown a bit and then served over or with boiled potatoes. The potatoes are soft enough to mash, and the greens that are served alongside like pickles and onions really bring the whole thing together. It feels like one of those dishes from very long ago that gives a lot of peace and serenity when you eat it. While it has been typically known as a dish for those with hefty pockets, it can also be a popular street food. In the 70s, though, it was more so exclusively kept to more well-off people because it was a bit unknown. Hailing from the lovely region of Provençal, bouillabaisse is a stew that is made with various kinds of fish, like monkfish or mullets, or even breams, shellfishes, sea urchins, crabs, and even octopi. This is entirely a seafood platter for even the most hardcore marine life fan, and that is part of why it would end up on the fanciest tables in the nation. Not only was it a chore to prepare, but sourcing all the ingredients was a pretty pricey shopping trip. Lobsters from Norway and Dublin Bay prawn were all too available to our rich brethren in the 70s, and they definitely took all the advantage they could of the fact. The stew is extremely hearty, the kind of thing to put the vigor of a youthful boy back into the bones of an old man. Something that would look right at home in a sequel to Ratatouille or some other Disney B-movie about the blessings of good eating. Now, this one might raise your eyebrows, and if this is considered fine dining, then maybe leaving it behind in the 70s was not such a bad idea. Pressed duck would be made by strangling a duck, then partially roasting it and grinding the liver. The body would be put into a special press to extract the blood and juices, which would be used to make a sauce, and it would get thickened with butter and cognac. So for people who have hemophobia, this is just right out the window. But in the 70s, this was a highlight of haute cuisine. Apparently, the sauce did not taste like blood at all. We end this list with perhaps the most French-American dish yet. We all know Uncle Sam loves his scallops, and French love their reduction wine sauces. So what do you get when you mix both for people who make millions a year? Get ready to pronounce this one, because Coquille Saint-Jacques is a name that will take a few tries. It is also a dish that will take more than a few attempts to really nail the flavor, but once you do, you will be so glad you never gave up on it. Typically, you have it with Gruyere cheese, which in itself costs what a good meal would for normal people, and creamy white sauces are a common side to the dish. The dish was exclusively made privately for upper-class folk, and only restaurants where you had to reserve weeks in advance would serve it. Those were the days of the 70s, and most of these dishes aren't mainstream anymore, but it's still amazing to see the unique experiences money could buy. That is it for the list. Did you find these rich people's food interesting? If so, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and let's keep those memories alive.